He had been coming to this grave for 19 years. He came alone because that was the only way to come. His mother had stopped coming after the third year. His father had never come at all. The chapter had moved on in the way chapters move on, with a silence that was not quite forgiveness and not quite condemnation, but was, in practice, the same as both. The town had its version of the story and had been living with it for long enough that the story had hardened into fact, the way stories do when no one challenges them. Ray Doss came every year on the 14th of October, because that was the date, and he came alone, and he stood at the stone, and he said whatever needed saying, and he left. He had been doing this for 19 years. This was the first time anyone else had been here when he arrived. She was a small woman, white-haired, standing with her back to him at the grave, and she did not hear him approach on the grass. She had flowers, not a florist's arrangement, just something cut from a garden, held loosely in one hand, the stems uneven. She was wearing a gray coat and her shoulders were not quite still, and Ray stopped a few feet behind her and was about to step back when she turned. She looked at him. He looked at her. He said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. This is my brother's grave." She looked at the stone. She looked at him. Something in her face moved through several things in a short time. She said, "I know." She looked at him for another moment, and then she said it, quietly, not for the grave, not for herself, for him, looking directly at him, with the specific quality of a person who has been waiting to say a thing for a very long time and has finally found the person it was meant for. "Your brother never left you." Ray went still. She said it again, lower, more careful, the way you say something a second time when the first time has landed wrong, and you need the person to hear what it actually means. He never left. He was watching. He found a way. Ray looked at her. He said, "Who are you?" She said, "My name is Margaret Reese." She paused. "In 1971, your brother Eli saved my husband's life, and 3 other men's lives, and nobody was ever told." The cemetery on the edge of Dunmore, Virginia was called Greenleaf, and it had a small military section in the far corner, separated from the civilian plots by a low stone border and a half-dozen American flags maintained by the local VFW. The military section held 31 graves, most of them from World War II and Korea, 3 from Vietnam. Eli Doss was one of the 3. His stone said his name, his years, 1948 to 1971, and his service branch, because that much had been undisputed. It did not say how he died, because the official record of how he died was a document that used language designed to say as little as possible: non-combat fatality. Circumstances under investigation. The investigation had been closed 6 months after it opened. No findings had been published. The case had been filed and the file had stayed filed. And what the town of Dunmore knew was what someone had told someone, which was that Eli Doss had died drunk, off base, in a situation that reflected poorly on him and on the family, and that was the least said the better. The family had said very little. The chapter Eli had ridden with before he shipped had said less. Ray Doss had been 14 years old when his brother went to Vietnam, and 22 years old when the letter came. And in the 43 years between the letter and this October morning, he had read the official record 17 times and understood it less each time, and carried the specific compound grief of a man who lost a brother and was given, in place of a reason, an implication, the kind designed to make the family too ashamed to ask questions. He had asked questions anyway. He had asked questions for 43 years and had found nothing, and he had come to believe that nothing was what there was to find, and he had made his peace with the stone and the date and the coming alone. And now a woman named Margaret Reese was standing at his brother's grave with garden flowers in her hand and saying things that his brain was refusing and his body was receiving differently. He said, "Tell me, before we get to what Margaret Reese had been carrying for 53 years, and before we get to what Ray Doss did with it, subscribe if you're new here and drop your city in the comments. I read everyone, because what this woman knew and what she kept because she was told to keep it, and what she decided on the 14th of October after 19 years of coming to this grave alone, is something that is going to stay with you for a long time." Ray Doss was 57 years old and had been writing for 34 years and had a face that had been serious since he was 22 and had not found a reason to stop. He was not a large man, but he was a still one, the kind of stillness that comes from a long time of carrying something heavy and learning to carry it without advertising the weight. He had been a machinist for 26 years and had retired early on account of his back, and now he repaired things for people at a reasonable rate and rode when the weather allowed and came to Greenleaf Cemetery on the 14th of October every year. He had been 14 when Eli shipped out. Eli had been 23, which in 1968 was the age of a man, but had seemed to Ray, at 14, impossibly old and impossibly young at the same time. Eli was the one who had taught Ray to ride, not a motorcycle, first a bicycle, then a dirt bike, then the old Honda that their father had condemned as a death machine and that Eli had kept in the shed anyway. Eli had the laugh that arrived in stages, first in his eyes and then in his chest, and then, only after both of those, in sound. He had read Steinbeck and Hemingway and had had opinions about both. He had been the kind of older brother who made you feel that being noticed by him was worth something. He had shipped in January of 1968 and been killed in October of 1971 at the age of 23, and Ray had grown up in the 43 years since in the specific shape of a man with a missing piece, which is different from a man who was never whole. It is the particular form of a person built around an absence. He had joined the chapter in his late 20s because Eli had ridden, because riding was one of the things Eli had given him, and because the chapter was where a thing of Eli still lived. He had not told them, when he joined, what the letter had said about how Eli died. He had told them his brother had been killed in Vietnam. The rest he had kept because the rest was a thing that had been designed to make people too ashamed to speak it aloud. And it had worked for 19 years in the chapter and for 43 years in the town and in the family, and it was working still, until this morning. Margaret Reese had been 19 years old in 1971, living outside Da Nang as part of a medical volunteer organization, and she had been present on the night of the 14th of October when a patrol from Eli Doss's unit had come in wrong. She told it plainly and without dramatics, the way a woman tells a story she has told in her own mind 10,000 times and has finally been given permission to say out loud. There had been 4 men from the patrol. They had come in through a compromised perimeter, and there was fire from 2 directions, and the 4 men were not going to make it to the next position without someone doing something that there was not time to plan, and not enough men to do safely. Eli Doss had done it. He had drawn the fire, not by accident, not because he was in the wrong place, deliberately moving into the open, creating a target, keeping it long enough for the 4 men to reach cover. He had been shot 3 times. He had walked to the medical station under his own power, and he had told Margaret, a 19-year-old girl with a medical kit in a plywood building outside Da Nang, that the 4 men had made it, and he needed her to note that in whatever she wrote down. She had written it down. She had written it all down, the names of the 4 men, the action, the deliberate nature of it, the words he had said before he lost consciousness. He had died 2 hours later. She had given what she wrote to his commanding officer, a man named Captain Gerald Ware, and she had been told it would be included in the official report and that she had done the right thing and that she should get back to her station. The official report had said, non-combat fatality, circumstances under investigation. She had written letters from Vietnam, from the airport in San Francisco when she came home, from the address in Wisconsin where she settled with her husband David, one of the 4 men who had made it to cover that night. She had written to the Army. She had written to her congressman. She had written once to the Doss family in 1979, and the letter had come back unopened with a forwarding notice that led to nothing. She had found Ray through the chapter's website 8 years ago and had written an email that she had drafted and deleted 14 times over the course of 3 months and had finally sent, and which had gone to an account no one checked and which she had not known how to follow up. She had started coming to the grave 6 years ago. Not every year, twice, then 3 times, building to this, the 14th of October, the anniversary, which was the day that seemed most right for saying the thing that needed saying to the person it was meant for. She had not expected him to be there. She had not expected to say it out loud. It had come out before she could stop it. And now it was said, and she was standing at the grave of a man she had watched die 53 years ago in a plywood building in a country that no longer existed by. That name and the man's brother was looking at her, and she was not going to take it back. Ray sat down on the grass. He did not decide to. His legs made the decision before his mind did, which is how certain kinds of news arrive. In the body first. Margaret sat down beside him. She was 72 years old and her knees had opinions about grass, but she sat. She took a folded paper from her coat pocket. It was a photocopy, worn at the creases, the kind that has been folded and unfolded until the paper has gone soft. She held it out. Ray took it. It was her handwritten account from 1971. The original, or copy of it, she had kept copies because she had learned early that originals had a way of disappearing. The names of the 4 men, David Reese among them, the action described in specific terms, in the specific words of a 19-year-old who had understood what she was watching and had written it down with all the exactness she had. And at the bottom, what Eli had said before he lost consciousness. Ray read it. He read it twice. He sat with it for a long time. There on the grass of Greenleaf Cemetery on the 14th of October, with Margaret Reese beside him and his brother Stone in front of him, and 53 years of a lie that had been designed to be too shameful to question sitting in his lap and a piece of photocopied paper with soft creases. He said he knew he wasn't going to make it. Margaret said, "I think so." Yes. Ray said, "He did it anyway." She said, "Gerald Ware was promoted 6 months later. He retired as a colonel in 1987. Ray said nothing for a moment. He said, "David, your husband." Margaret said, "He died in 2019. He talked about Eli every year on this day. He was the reason I kept writing letters. He said, someone has to know. Someone has to say it." Eli James Doss, 1948, 1971. No rank, no citation. No action, just a name and years and the implication of a story that was the wrong one. He said, "He should have a different stone." Margaret said, "Yes, he should." Ray said, "I'm going to make some calls." He made the first call from the cemetery parking lot, sitting on his bike with the engine off and the paper in his jacket pocket and the cold October air on his face. He called a man named Frank Tully, who was the chapter's veterans liaison and who had been in the Army himself 20 years, and who knew the language of official records and the specific channels through which the language could be changed. He told Frank everything. Frank was quiet for a moment. He said, "You have the written account." Ray said, "I have a photocopy. She has the original." Frank said, "And the names of the 4 men." Ray said, "3 of them are deceased. 1 I don't know yet." Frank said, 3 deceased with families, potentially, and Margaret's husband on record as a witness. He paused. "This is a correctable record, Ray. This can be fixed." Ray said, "How long? But it can be done." He paused. "Are you all right?" Ray said, "No." Frank said, "I'll start making calls tonight." He made 23 calls that night. By the following morning, he had a veterans advocacy attorney in Richmond and a contact at the Army Human Resources Command and a journalist in Washington who had written about exactly this category of case before, and who asked Frank 3 questions and said she wanted to see the document. By the end of the week, he had the families of 2 of the other 3 men from the patrol. One of them had been told a different version of their father's story, which shared the central feature of Ware's account, convenient silence, and which they had been carrying the way Ray had been carrying his, which was badly and alone. The record correction took 7 months. It was not easy, and it was not fast, and there were 3 separate denials before the 4th review, which was conducted by a board whose composition Frank had spent 6 months engineering through a process of calls and documentation, and the specific persistent courtesy of someone who knows that courtesy is not the same as backing down. On the 3rd of May, 11 months after the 14th of October, the Army issued a corrected record for Specialist Eli James Doss, United States Army, killed in action on the 14th of October, 1971, in the performance of a deliberate and documented act of valor that had been misclassified in the original report filed by his commanding officer. The Bronze Star with Valor device, which had been recommended in Margaret's 1971 account and which Ware had not forwarded, was authorized. A Silver Star, recommended by the advocacy attorney, based on the full account and supported by the families of the other men, was authorized the same day. They came on the 3rd Saturday of May. 531 motorcycles came to Dunmore, Virginia, and parked on the streets around Greenleaf Cemetery and walked through the gate in a quiet that had become, across these 11 scripts, the sound of this particular kind of arrival. Boots on gravel. The specific sound of people choosing to be somewhere rather than passing through. Ray stood at the grave. Margaret stood beside him. Frank Tully stood to Ray's left, with a case that held 2 medals, the Bronze Star and the Silver Star, authorized by the United States Army for Specialist Eli James Doss, 53 years after the action that had earned them. A representative from the Army Human Resources Command had driven from Richmond and stood with his hat in his hands and the specific expression of a man who represents an institution that failed at something and is attempting, imperfectly, to correct it. The journalist from Washington was at the back. A man named Carl Hines, who was 68 years old and whose father, James Hines, had been one of the 4 men on that patrol, stood on the other side of Margaret. He had driven 11 hours from Minnesota. He had found out about his father's story 6 months ago and had not slept well since, and had come today because someone had to come, and he was the one who could. The chapter's chaplain spoke for 5 minutes. He said Eli's full name. He said the date. He said what happened on that date in specific terms, because specific terms were what it deserved. He read the citation language that Frank had fought for 7 months to make exist. Then Frank opened the case. He gave the Bronze Star to Ray. Ray held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. He said quietly to the stone, 43 years. I'm sorry it took me that long. I didn't know where to look. He set it on the ground in front of the stone, against the base. Frank gave the Silver Star to Carl Hines, who received it the way you receive something you came 11 hours to receive, with both hands and without trying to manage what your face was doing. Carl set it beside the Bronze Star. The 2 medals sat at the base of the stone, in the May morning, in the grass of Greenleaf Cemetery, in front of a marker that had held a false story for 53 years and was now surrounded by 531 people who knew the true one. Ray looked at the stone. He looked at Margaret. She had come 6 years to this grave hoping to find someone to tell. She had found him on a morning she hadn't planned, with flowers from her garden and a paper in her pocket that had been folded and unfolded for 50 years, and she had said the thing before she could stop it, because the truth had been waiting that long and had run out of patience. He said, "Thank you." She said, "I should have found you sooner." He said, "You found me." She looked at the stone. She said, "He talked to me for 20 minutes before he died. He told me about you, about the dirt bike in the shed, about teaching his little brother to ride." She paused. "He said you were going to be something." Ray was quiet. She said, "He was right." The stone was replaced in July. Granite, gray, cut clean. His full name. His rank Specialist, United States Army. His unit, his dates. And below the 2 citations, abbreviated to their essence, below those, at Ray's instruction, 1 line, he drew the fire so others could reach cover. It was specific, and it was true, and it was the thing that had happened on the 14th of October in 1971 in a country that no longer existed by that name. And it was on the stone now, in the ground of Greenleaf Cemetery in Dunmore, Virginia, where it would remain. Ray came on the 14th of October. He came alone, the way he always had, because that morning was between him and Eli, and always had been. But on the other Saturdays, the first Saturday of every month, as long as the weather held, he came with people. Frank, Carl Hines, when Carl could make the drive, which was more often than 11 hours should reasonably allow. Chapter members who had heard the story and had asked quietly if they could come. Margaret came in the spring and the fall. She brought flowers from her garden, stems uneven the way she always had. She set them against the stone, and she talked to Eli for a few minutes in the way she had been talking to him since 1971, which was with the directness of someone who has been carrying a conversation for 50 years and has finally found a way to finish it. She never stopped bringing garden flowers. She said once to Ray that she thought Eli would have preferred them to the florist kind. Ray said he knew Eli would have. She said he had opinions. Ray said, "He told me you were going to be something." Ray said, "You mentioned that." She said, "I'll keep mentioning it." She did. Some men die in the performance of something extraordinary, and the record says otherwise, and the family carries the wrong story for 50 years, because someone with a reason to cover it up had the power to do so. And sometimes a woman comes to a grave with garden flowers on the anniversary of the day, hoping to finally find the right person, and finds him there and says the thing before she can stop herself. And the truth doesn't undo the 50 years. It doesn't give back the grief or the shame or the 19 years of coming alone. But it changes what the stone says, and it changes what the man at the stone knows when he stands there. And 500 people come on a Saturday in May, and they stand in the grass, and they hear the name said right and the story told true for the first time. And the grave gets the 2 medals beside it that were earned in 1971, and the mourning holds all of it, and the record is corrected. It is not enough. It is never enough. But it is something, and it is done. If this story reached you, if you believe that no one who did something extraordinary should have that truth buried with them, share it tonight with someone who needs to hear that records can be corrected and stories can be told. Right. Subscribe so you never miss the next story. Drop your city in the comments. And if you know someone whose story was buried, or if you have been carrying someone else's truth and waiting for the right person to tell, type ELI in the comments. I read every single one.